14, verses 9 through 14. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Here ends the lesson.
So today we're seeking mercy. It's an interesting topic, and it's fascinating to me that so often in Jesus' stories and Jesus' parables, he introduces us to a topic, but then kind of tends to move on. And so often there's more questions than answers. What is mercy? What is this attitude? Help me understand. When am I helpful and when am I not helpful? And who is this God that we're coming towards? What I'd like to do this morning is obviously just spend some time digging into Jesus' teachings around this story and around other stories. But first, just a little history, personal history. I have a background in biblical studies, and I also have a background in psychology and counseling. And as a therapist, there were 2 truisms that I learned that might be helpful to our conversation today. The first is the importance of pursuing the story behind the story. In other words, oftentimes it's helpful to look at what some of the underlying causes or maybe some of the underlying influences might be that brings us to the story today. For instance, if someone has problems with math, well, we could deal with that particular story that we're dealing with now by simply being a math tutor and helping them understand math in more detail. But we also might want to look at the story behind the story, some of the influences that might be affecting that particular setting of someone having trouble with math. We might want to consider some maybe auditory issues. Is the person hearing the conversation, or is there a problem in their as far as hearing is concerned? Or maybe there's some problems or situations involving the eyes, eye-hand coordination, dyslexic type things, where the teacher puts 12 on the board, 1, 2, but the person's brain interprets that backward, 2, 1. Big difference between subtracting 12 or 21. A story behind the story. We'll be coming back to that. The second thing that I learned as a therapist is that in the context of a therapist, the assumption is that a therapist can only help someone go as far as he or she has gone themselves. In other words, I can't help you understand peace and wholeness deeper than what I've already experienced myself. I can't take you further than what I've gone. Again, in the realm of math, that's pretty obvious. If I understand algebra, if I understand geometry, but I was totally lost when it came to calculus, if you asked me to teach you calculus, we're all in trouble. I don't understand it, so how can I teach it? But the assumption is that's also true in other realms around us. In the world of faith, the assumption would be that as a pastor, I couldn't take you closer to God than what I've experienced myself. And I think we could say the same for a Sunday school teacher, a youth leader, anyone in the church. Now, would this also be true when we're dealing with topics such as compassion and mercy? Can we understand or practice compassion or mercy deeper than what we've experienced in our own personal lives? Well, let's apply these two principles as we explore some concepts around mercy in this particular story and others. What about experiencing mercy in our own lives? I've thought about this preparing for today, and I can remember times where I've asked people for mercy, times that I said some really stupid stuff or done something that was rather foolish, and I wanted to approach the person to receive forgiveness, mercy. Sometimes I came away really blessed by the experience because I felt like we experienced God's presence. And then there were other times where I came away feeling emotionally, spiritually belittled. Sometimes it seems that we feel the need to extend Christian charity with strings attached. Or sometimes we need to extend mercy with a scowl on our face and a scowl in our heart. Sometimes it seems that it's more important to hold on to a grudge than it is to pursue Christian mercy. So what's the difference? Why is it that sometimes we can respond to mercy and other times it seems that we can't? Is mercy important to Jesus' message? And I think that's obviously true. When we look at some of the Beatitudes, the mercy is connected to the fifth Beatitude. Happy are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. When we look at some of Jesus' most profound and well-known parables, the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, the subject of mercy just oozes through. Without a doubt, Jesus considered mercy very, very important. So why is it after 2,000 years, we as the followers of Jesus often tend to struggle and understand this practice of mercy? Is it because we don't understand the definition of mercy? Would it help to break into small groups and maybe role play some different scenarios that imply the use of mercy? Should we sponsor a 10-week course on mercy? No, I think it would be more helpful to dig deeper. When we build a concept like mercy, we need to consider what resources or concepts that would be most helpful the story behind the story, to build that construct. As a follower of Jesus, I want to first consider what seemed to be most important to Jesus as he was building some of those concepts. And as we look at Jesus' ministry, it seems to me that one of the underlying constructs that Jesus continually refers back to when he talks about grace or compassion or mercy was Jesus' understanding about the nature of God. Jesus over and over describes God as being a God of love and compassion and grace and mercy. The concept of a loving, compassionate God was not totally new to the people that would have heard Jesus talk. But as we look at the biblical material, it was the minority view at best. The majority view at that time would be a God that can be summed up by a preacher in the 1800s, Jonathan Edwards, who was a kind of a popular traveling minister like Billy Graham, very well known, very involved in life. He coined the term an angry God. The God that hardened the heart of Pharaoh. The God that sent famine and flood and enemies because people disobeyed his commands. This God, for Edwards, was the angry God. And oftentimes, when Edwards would be preaching, he would have to stop his sermons to take care of someone who might have fainted in the congregation, or sometimes someone would get up and screech out and run out of the auditorium out of fear. A quick quote from one of Edwards' sermons. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string. And justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow. And it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment but being flung at your heart. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much like one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. And his wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire of hell. That, my friends, is an angry God. Now, where do we find in the biblical material, where do we find that angry God? Well, some people say that we find that God in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament we find a God of grace. That works real well until you make the mistake of actually reading the text. And then that falls apart quickly. Yes, we do have a lot of history with this angry God in the Old Testament. But we also see an angry God as we approach the end of the New Testament. Friends of mine who study comparative religion among the enduring religions of the world assure me over and over again that the book of Revelation is the most violent religious text, the most violent religious book ever written when considering all the religions, the enduring religions, Islam, Buddhism, Tao, all the enduring religions. But where do we find this loving, compassionate God? Well, in the Old Testament, we get some glimmers of that God, kind of like a volcanic island bubbling up in the middle of the ocean. We see some glimmers. And in the New Testament, we see this compassionate God coming into full bloom in Jesus' ministry throughout the four Gospels. Illustration after illustration, telling us time and time again that God's heart overflows with mercy, love, and compassion. Well, what do you think? Why was it so important to Jesus that we understand that God's heart is filled with love and compassion? It seems to me that it was clear that Jesus understood that we cannot practice meaningful mercy without having that basic experience of knowing that the core of God's heart is filled with love and anger, or is not filled with anger, but love. Think about it. If we approach an angry God and ask for mercy, what surrounds us? What surrounds us is fear and anxiety, and at best, conditional love. Do these emotions help us to understand mercy? Instead, it seems important to me that Jesus is calling us to rid ourselves of that angry God image. Jesus assures us that mercy and compassion fills every crack and crevice of God's house. It flows from every stream. It is as plentiful as sunshine in July. According to Jesus, we have nothing to fear when we approach God. Since we are followers of Christ, and since we want to take Jesus' ministry seriously, I think it's important to us that we follow some of these understandings that Jesus had. Work to get rid of that angry God image and focus on the God of love. But if we do that, I have to warn you, there's a cost. One thing that I've noticed is that today, when we talk with one another, that image of the God that sends floods and droughts and hurricanes and wars when we're bad, and only blesses us when we're good, is very prevalent today. And I have to admit that when I'm faced with those conversations, I really have nothing to offer. And then there's also another cost, in fact, a deeper cost. Sometimes today we still associate many of the attributes at the core of Jesus' teachings as signs of weakness. In business, in life, we often tend to value that tough, no-nonsense, savvy, hard negotiator type of person. After all, we say, well, if you don't take care of number one, who is? And we say, let's face it, it's a tough world out there. If you're not tough, people are going to walk all over you. But as I dig into Jesus' teachings, I know that's not true. Instead, I start to see that oftentimes a tough exterior indicates a hurting, vulnerable interior. And I'm discovering that it takes years and years of work and strength to attempt to model Jesus' teachings. If you're looking for a challenge and want to build strong character and effective leadership, dig into the Beatitudes, dig into the parables. Then we discover that it's rather easy to be that tough, self-centered bully type. But only the strong can approach Jesus' concepts of compassion, of mercy. So how would Jesus summarize our conversation today? What would he say to us on our journey for mercy? Maybe he would say something like this. Come to me, all who are burdened and weary, and I'll introduce you to a God that knows no boundaries, to all that is good and fair. And when your heart is filled with that understanding of God, you will be free. Free to experience unconditional mercy and realize that mercy is not a scarce commodity to cling on to, but instead it's an abundant commodity to share freely with others. And soon your inside world will grow in confidence and character, and you will have the stuff necessary to practice fairness and justice, compassion and mercy. Then when you're dealing with the world out there, you will be free in here. And instead of simply working to make more and more money, you will be free to work to make a difference. And instead of simply working to be more and more successful, you will be free to work to be valuable. And instead of simply seeking private gain, you will be set free to work for the common good. Practicing mercy. I think it's clear from Jesus' message that it starts up there and it starts in here. Amen. Our next song, number 529. If you would join me in singing verses 1 and 3. 1 and 3. Sing together.
Don't forget to visit us on the web at apostlesucc.org.